Securing peace in eastern Ukraine was again on the agenda recently when Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko and German Chancellor Angela Merkel met in Berlin. But what messages are both leaders trying to send to the Kremlin? What will happen next in Donbass? Joining us right now on the programme is Andrei Valchishin, a political expert and consultant. Andrei, thank you for coming in on Viewpoint.
Thank you for the invitation.
Let's start with the Minsk deal. The second was signed a year ago now, and many of the points have still yet to be fulfilled. Sort of full control of the Ukrainian-Russian border, withdrawal of heavy weapons, and exchange of prisoners, this sort of thing. So what's happening? What's the latest then?
Today we can state that none of the points of Minsk agreement was fulfilled. And basically what we have seen yesterday, the meeting of Petro Poroshenko and Angela Merkel, there is a good point that was stated by both of them, that sanctions against Russia will not be dismissed until visible progress will be seen in implementation of Minsk agreement. From the other side, this is not a strategic victory. Sanctions are some of the only instruments, effective instruments to influence Russian government that are currently in the game. And we can lose them due to the nature of Minsk agreement itself and due to the perception of this process by some of Western politicians.
What I found really interesting from what was said yesterday was that nothing was really changed. I mean, both leaders, they had the same rhetoric as previous times. So what sort of tactics do you think the politicians in Kiev and the Ukrainian president, what are they using? Are they just playing a waiting game with the Kremlin now?
To understand the game of political players here in Kiev and in Brussels and in Berlin, we also need to understand Russian strategy. So Russia effectively manipulates with Syrian crisis, with Libyan crisis. It pressures the European Union through the migration problems from one point. And secondly, it needs a product for domestic use. Russian government needs new empirical myths to explain their people why those corrupted people are still in power. The main problem with Minsk agreement is the following, that it doesn't recognize Russia as a side of conflict. Russia has a role of arbitrary role in this process, and it is not good for Ukraine to protect its national interests, because international law provides certain mechanisms when there is aggression from one country on another.
Well, that's true, but at the same time, if there's Russian tanks in Ukraine, how successful would international law be in this case anyway?
Those are obvious facts, but they are not supported by the international law, and they are not recognized in the international documents. This is a problem with Minsk agreement.
But even if they were, how would that impact what Russia does in Ukraine?
This is probably not none of the players have answer for this question right now, because if United States would have it, or Angela Merkel or France, they probably would introduce it. There is also always a balance between the need to keep peace in the world and to keep the stability, and not to play war games with such an unexpected player as Russia, and to do business as usual. And it is very important for Germany and for France. And so there is a conflict of interests in this regard, and it makes the situation even worse.
But the countries like Germany and France, they're in a difficult position almost, because they also do a lot of trade with Russia. So it's a fine balancing act, isn't it?
It is obvious. It is obvious, but as we see with migration crisis in Europe, they are only short-term activities, and just doing business as usual is not effective, and questions stability in their own countries, which we see from the last events.
Does it though? Because wasn't there some politicians recently from France and also from Germany who actually went to Moscow? So what sort of message does that send to Ukraine? That's negative, isn't it?
Of course. By the way, there were statements of Minister of Agriculture in France who told that he expects that sanctions against Russia will be abolished, and that it is not only his own position, but also the position of Ministry of Economy of France and also of French President. And we have seen also the similar statements from the side of Germany, German officials. What it tells that Ukraine should take care about its own interests at the first place, and if Minsk model proves to be ineffective, and it is, more than that, time to implement those agreements has ended at the end of previous year, and we should find new ways.
Yeah. Do you think that Ukraine is now protecting its own interests as it is at the moment?
Unfortunately, no, and there are a lot of expert negotiations and discussions right now in Ukraine whether the Minsk model should be kept as an effective way to solve this crisis.
Yeah. I mean, are there any other effective ways, though, to solve this crisis? You have the Minsk deal. I mean, unless you send in hundreds of Ukrainian tanks to get rid of the Russian ones, then what other options are there?
Minsk deal has four major faults. First of all, it doesn't recognize Russia as aggressor formally. Secondly, the question of Crimea is not in the agenda. Thirdly, it imposes limited sovereignty on Ukraine. And basically, in this interpretation that we see from the side of Russia and from the side of some European politicians, those regions should be able to influence even Ukrainian foreign policy. And time to implement those agreements has ended up. That's why it is a very good time for Ukraine to start new negotiations that would involve United States and some other major players. Ukraine has signed Budapest Memorandum in 1995.
Yeah.
Of course, many people tell that it is just a shelf document and it is not effective, but it is a very important case if guarantees are being given to some country and it refuses to develop nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. And so it can be a case for other countries not to go this way, the way the Ukraine has gone. Also, there is a second point that this process is not very well perceived by Ukrainian population and Ukrainian voters.
The Minsk deal.
The Minsk deal in particular. Recently, a sociological group Rating has conducted a survey. It was conducted on the request of International Republican Institute and Government of Canada and funded by Government of Canada. And only 8% of Ukrainian population, and more than that, nearly the same amount of people in the free territories of Donetsk and Luhansk regions support the special status to Donbass.
Yeah.
Probably this is why it is so hard for President Poroshenko to collect 300 votes in parliament to implement those constitutional.
Well, it's a very difficult
changes.
situation, though, for the Ukrainian president, because even if Ukraine tried to get these occupied areas of Donetsk and Luhansk back, then after all this time, the whole infrastructure has been destroyed. A lot of the views have been changed as well. It would cost billions to repair everything. So
it is just one side of the problem. The bigger part of the problem is that special status to those regions and untransparent way to form authorities in those regions, that it can have significant and very long-lasting effects on Ukrainian policy, both domestic and foreign.
And this process of decentralization, though, do you think that this is actually understood by the Ukrainian population?
Unfortunately, no. Not enough communication is being done by government, and more than that, the style in which government passes the major decisions, such as decentralization reform or budget, they are not good for strategic communication with population and with the perspective to stabilize the situation here in Ukraine.
So just one final question to finish on. What do you think the future is for this Donbass region, and how effective do you think this Minsk deal will be going forward?
I think it is ineffective. We see that the United States are becoming more and more active in this negotiation process. Recently, Minister of Foreign Affairs Klimkin has stated that new round of consultations in accordance to Budapest Memorandum is needed. So I hope that new strategy of solving this question will be introduced soon.
OK, Andrei, thank you very much for coming
Tom.
onto our programme here on Ukraine Today.
Thank you.
That was Andrei Valchishin. He is a political expert and consultant. We've been talking about the Minsk ceasefire deal. Now, back to the news.